Which is it?
I'm Zev Elef, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Hebrew Theological College, and I'm joined today by Professor Eli Lederhendler. He is the Stephen S. Wise Professor of American Jewish History at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the Chair of the Jewish History Department. And Eli, pretty recently, produced a very, very important book for the field, American Jewry, A New History with Cambridge, that really challenges certain paradigms in the field. It's a survey, and as surveys go, it accomplished scholars try to weave together their essays and their books and create an intelligible sweep of history. In 2004, both Jonathan Sarna and Hasia Diner produced their very important and well-read and much publicized works. And you too have produced a very important work, which I think challenges not just Diner and Sarna, but also the field in general.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. It is, my subtitle is A New History, American Jewry, A New History. The most likely way that many readers may interpret that phrase, a new history, is that, well, there have been other histories of American Jewry, and here's a new one. And that's certainly in line with, as you say, the changes or the new approaches that I'm hoping are presented in the book to the reader. But actually, it's a sort of a pun, because American Jewry, A New History, also means that American Jewry's history is new in the framework of Jewish history as a whole. It's a new history that only goes back to the middle of the 17th century. I say only. In American history studies, that's all there is, back to the 1500s or the 1600s. In composing the book and constructing it the way I did, I was proposing two balanced ideas. One, that the Jewish part of American history needs to be told as part of American history, but the American part of Jewish history needs to be told as part of the longer sweep of Jewish history. And how do you balance those two ideas? How do you present it in a way that makes, at least, I hope, some kind of sense? So to do the first part, I threw out the already somewhat obsolete division of American Jewish history into the classic three immigration wave periods: the Sephardic wave, the German wave, and the Russian wave.
Right, and so for the uninitiated, that's the Jacob Rader Marcus model. That's the one that Jonathan Sarna uses in his American Judaism. 1654. Really till 1820 is that Spanish-Portuguese Sephardic migration. 1820 to 1881 is the German migration and its perseverance and dominance in the community. In 1881 onward, really until the Shoah, is that Russian migration, Eastern Europe.
Right. So, and even Marcus in his day actually modified that into a five-part division. Be that as it may, what I did was I said, okay, let's go from the colonial era right through the Civil War, partly because there were so few Jews. We're talking about a very, very small number of people. Up until the American Revolution, we're talking barely 2,000 people, 2,500 people in terms of the Jews living in the American colonies, which isn't a great deal, even compared to the 16th and 17th century elsewhere in the world. There were places with 60,000 Jews in one city. So I took the colonial and the early national period and right up to the Civil War and made that one long initial period of the history of America as a country, and showed where Jews who came to settle during those years, where did they fit into the story of America as it was developing. I then, after the Civil War, went from the 1860s to the 1920s, which includes both part of the ongoing migration of Jews from Central Europe, as well as the more massive influx of Jews who came to the United States from Eastern Europe. And I took it up to the end of World War I, and in fact, the entire sequence of wars involving the United States in the 20th century are very important markers for the political development of the United States. So I use that sort of American history sequence of events or periodization in order to tell the story of the Jews as part of American history. That takes us up to the 1920s, and then, in fact, it goes up to the 1930s in one more chapter. But then what I did was I threw a monkey wrench into the works, and I said, okay, let's interrupt this sort of steady sequence of migration, settlement, and integration, which is the kind of a standard immigration ethnicity story that's told in American historiography. And put in a chapter about what made the Jews in the United States rather different from most other population groups in the United States then or since then. And that chapter is a thematic chapter that's devoted to the ways in which Jews in the United States carried on being connected to Jews around the world, and in particular, Jews who were living in troubled areas of the world from the 19th century through the 20th century. And in that sense, I was constructing a bridge between Jewish history at large, mostly as it transpired in Europe, and what was going through the minds of the leadership of the Jewish community in the United States in various stages along the way. And by doing that, I kind of tried to insert this sort of double vision, that it's not just in the United States that American Jewish history happened.
And I think how provocative it is, right, is that whereas one school of thought had it that the formative period in the 18th and 19th century, early 19th centuries, while you're right, 1,000 Jews, there were only 150,000 Jews, for example, at the time of the Civil War. By the time we get to 1900, there's 1 million. So in sheer numbers, certainly we have to move very forward in time to that Eastern European migration. So one school of thought had it that, okay, there weren't so many Jews, but it was a formative period. Institutions were built, culture was established. Another school, and we referred to it before, the long 19th century, which Hasia Diner has borrowed from to argue about the stream of migration that begins early in the century and moves onward. She also offered at the time a very provocative argument. And here you come along, and not to say that you came along, this is very much part of your scholarship, and I want to make sure that folks understand it, is that what I think you're interested in is reestablishing American Jewish history as part of the Atlantic, as a part of a cross-cultural and economic transferability between European Jews and American Jews. You look at politics, you look at economics, you look at culture, and you really do situate American Jewish history and modern European Jewish history in a way that scholars of both fields can finally speak to one another.
That's absolutely true. I wanted this sort of transnational aspect to come through in a very upfront way, and that's why I did fiddle with the periodization. I did put in that thematic chapter about the European nexus, the sort of transatlantic or global, if you will. But in terms of that sort of larger debate, American period, I have no particular axe to grind in terms of suggesting that the period of East European migration is the most formative of all. That's not what I wrote in the book. What I've written is that American Jewish history, very similar to American history at large, is a history of many new beginnings. That each time that there is a new beginning, and a new beginning means new people are coming over and starting lives in a new way, in a new country, a country that has its own dynamic and has changed in the meantime. And so the adaptations that Jewish immigrants and their children will make to American society will be different in the 1870s than they were in the 1770s or the 1820s. And to try, what I did was to challenge that long arc of continuity that other scholars have tried to establish. And I said, no, there are these many new beginnings. Each family, each cohort, each cultural or sub-ethnic group within the immigrant population that arrives is doing things a bit differently, and that needs to be taken into account.
Right, so it's interesting, framed that way, the various scholars who have undertaken the project of doing a sweep of American Jewish history, the major debates and interpretations have much to do with that duality, the binary of continuity and discontinuities, and where you create them, and where you create new bursts of newness, of beginnings, as you put it. And it makes it a triple entendre, right, of a new history. New history is constantly moving forward, is maybe the greatest and most exciting challenge in writing the story of American Jews. Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.